Picture this. You're a Lakota warrior in 1725, living in the woodlands of what we'd call Minnesota today, hunting deer on foot with maybe a dog or two helping you carry supplies. Fast forward just 50 years, and your grandson is thundering across the plains on a war pony, controlling a herd of maybe 30 horses, shooting arrows with deadly accuracy at full gallop. And your people have become the most feared mounted warriors on the entire North American continent. That transformation, that complete reinvention of an entire culture's way of war in basically 2 generations, is one of the most remarkable military evolutions in human history. And it's the foundation of everything that happened at Little Bighorn. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if these history tales fascinate you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Now, here's what people don't understand about the horse and the Lakota. This wasn't just about getting a new way to travel. This was about a complete transformation of society, economics, warfare, everything. When Spanish horses started filtering north from Mexico and the Spanish settlements in the early 1700s, they didn't arrive with instruction manuals. The Lakota and other plains tribes had to figure out everything from scratch. And figure it out they did, with an ingenuity that would make modern Special Forces operations planners take notes. The first horses that reached the northern plains were small, hardy animals descended from Spanish stock. Think about 13 to 14 hands high. That's maybe 4.5 feet at the shoulder, smaller than the thoroughbreds we picture today. But these animals were tough, adapted to harsh conditions, and they could survive on prairie grass when there was nothing else available. The Lakota called them Shankwakan, literally sacred dog, because at first they couldn't quite comprehend what they were dealing with. A dog that could carry a grown man? That could run for hours without tiring? It must be sacred. But the real genius of the Lakota wasn't just in acquiring horses. It was in what they did next. They became the master horse breeders of the plains. Lakota women, and this is crucial to understand, took charge of breeding programs that would impress modern equestrians. They bred specifically for war ponies, animals that could stop on a dime, accelerate instantly, turn at full gallop, and most importantly, remain calm in combat when arrows and bullets were flying and men were screaming. A good war pony was worth perhaps 10 ordinary horses. A truly exceptional one? That animal was priceless, often receiving as much care and attention as a family member, and the Lakota didn't just ride these horses. They became one with them in ways that shocked everyone who witnessed it. Warriors developed techniques that seemed physically impossible to European and American observers. Shooting arrows accurately while riding at full gallop, that's hard enough. But the Lakota could drop down, hooking one leg over the horse's back and one arm through a loop of braided horsehair, and ride along the side of their mount, using the horse's body as a shield while firing arrows beneath its neck. Try to imagine the core strength, the balance, the trust between rider and animal required to pull that off. And they could do this while riding at speeds approaching 30 miles per hour across broken terrain. The warrior societies, the elite military clubs within Lakota culture, perfected these techniques through relentless practice and competition. Young men would spend years training, starting as boys barely able to walk. By the time they were 15 or 16, the best of them could perform maneuvers that would look choreographed, except they were doing it in combat conditions where a single mistake meant death. They could shoot 20 arrows in the time it took a soldier to reload a single-shot rifle. 20 arrows. Let that sink in. By the time an infantry soldier with a Springfield rifle circa 1876 had fired once, reloaded and prepared to fire again, a Lakota warrior could have put 20 arrows in the air, each one potentially lethal. But here's what really gave the Lakota their edge. Horses meant mobility on a scale that changed everything about plains warfare. A Lakota warrior wasn't riding one horse. He might have 5 or 6 war ponies with him on a raid, switching between them to keep the animals fresh. A Lakota band could move their entire village, hundreds of people, 50 miles in a day, if they needed to. An army unit with supply wagons? They'd be lucky to make 15 miles in the same time. This mobility meant the Lakota could concentrate force where they wanted it, strike when they chose, and disappear before reinforcements arrived. And it wasn't just about fighting. Controlling horses meant controlling the buffalo economy. With horses, hunters could kill enough buffalo to provide for large communities, to create surplus for trade. Lakota territory expanded dramatically because they could hold the prime buffalo hunting grounds against all comers. By the mid-1800s, the Lakota controlled a territory spanning from the Missouri River west into the Powder River country, from the Platte River north into Canada. That's an area comparable to France or Texas. They held it not through treaties or negotiations, but through military superiority that rested entirely on their mastery of mounted warfare. When white soldiers first encountered Lakota warriors in combat, they were facing an enemy that had spent 150 years perfecting the art of mounted warfare on the Great Plains. These weren't primitive fighters with Stone Age weapons. These were highly trained, superbly mounted, tactically sophisticated warriors who could coordinate complex maneuvers across miles of terrain, using nothing but hand signals and prearranged plans. They were, quite simply, the finest light cavalry on the North American continent. And in 1876, at a place called the Little Bighorn, the United States Army was about to discover exactly what that meant. The first time the United States Army truly understood what they were dealing with, 81 men died in 40 minutes. December 21st, 1866, just outside Fort Phil Kearny in what's now Wyoming. Captain William Fetterman, a Civil War veteran who had survived some of the bloodiest battles of that conflict, supposedly said he could ride through the entire Sioux Nation with 80 men. He got his chance to test that theory. He didn't survive long enough to revise his opinion. Red Cloud, the Oglala Lakota war leader, had been watching the army build forts along the Bozeman Trail, the road that cut through the heart of Lakota hunting grounds to reach the goldfields in Montana. He'd been patient, studying how the soldiers moved, how they thought, how they fought. And on that freezing December day, he set a trap that would have made Hannibal proud. A small party of warriors appeared near a wood-cutting detail, just enough to be threatening. Fetterman took the bait, leading 80 men over Lodge Trail Ridge in pursuit. What happened next was a masterclass in ambush warfare. Over 2,000 Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors had been waiting, concealed in ravines and behind ridges. When they struck, it was total annihilation. 40 minutes from first contact to last shot. Back at the fort, soldiers heard the gunfire build to a crescendo, then fade to scattered shots, then silence. By the time relief forces were even saddled up, every single man in Fetterman's command was dead. Some of the bodies were found with dozens of arrows in them. The Lakota had been testing their new repeating rifles too, captured or traded from various sources. The message was unmistakable. We can match your firepower, and we can destroy you in detail if you leave your fortifications. That massacre shook the army to its core, but it was just the beginning. Red Cloud kept up the pressure for 2 more years, attacking supply trains, isolating the forts, making the Bozeman Trail completely unusable. And here's what's remarkable: he won. In 1868, the United States government signed the Fort Laramie Treaty, agreeing to abandon the forts and close the Bozeman Trail. Red Cloud had fought the United States Army to a standstill and forced them to accept his terms. As the soldiers marched out of Fort Phil Kearny, Lakota warriors burned it to the ground. It was the only time in the entire history of the Indian Wars that the army completely withdrew from a territory because they'd been militarily defeated. But treaties, as the Lakota would learn again and again, were only as good as the government's desire to honor them. And then someone discovered gold in the Black Hills. The Black Hills, Pahasapa, the heart of everything. This wasn't just land to the Lakota. This was the center of their spiritual world, the place where Lakota leaders went for visions, where the spirits of their ancestors dwelled. The Fort Laramie Treaty had explicitly guaranteed the Black Hills to the Lakota forever. Forever lasted exactly 6 years. In 1874, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer led an expedition into the Black Hills and confirmed the presence of gold. The news hit the American press like a thunderbolt. Gold in amounts that could make men rich overnight. Within months, thousands of prospectors were flooding into the Black Hills, treaty or no treaty. The government made a half-hearted attempt to keep miners out, then gave up and tried to buy the Black Hills instead. They offered $6 million. The Lakota, quite reasonably, refused to sell their sacred center for any amount of money. So the government simply declared that any Lakota not on a reservation by January 31st, 1876, would be considered hostile and subject to military action. In the middle of winter, on the northern plains, they expected thousands of people to move their villages to reservations or be attacked. It was bureaucratic absurdity designed to provide legal cover for what was about to happen. Sitting Bull, the Hunkpapa Lakota holy man and leader, had seen enough. He'd never signed the Fort Laramie Treaty, never accepted reservation life, never compromised with the American government. In the spring of 1876, he sent out a call to all the Lakota bands, to the Cheyenne, to anyone who wanted to resist. Come to the Powder River country. Come to the last good buffalo hunting grounds. Come and we'll make a stand together. And they came. They came in numbers that stunned everyone. Bands that usually kept apart, that had their own territories and their own councils, all converging on the valleys of the Powder River and the Rosebud and the Little Bighorn. By June, there might have been 10,000 people gathered, perhaps 1,500 to 2,000 warriors. It was the largest gathering of Native American military power ever assembled on the Great Plains. Maybe in North American history, Sitting Bull, preparing for what was coming, participated in a sun dance ceremony that became legendary. For 2 days he danced, staring at the sun, having his adopted brother cut 50 pieces of flesh from each arm as an offering to the spirits. And in his exhaustion and pain, he had a vision. He saw soldiers falling upside down into the Lakota camp, like grasshoppers falling from the sky. It was a prophecy of victory, of soldiers dying, and word of that vision spread through the camp like electricity. The spirits had spoken. The soldiers were coming, and they would fall. The United States Army, meanwhile, was preparing a campaign with all the confidence of a force that had just won the Civil War and spent a decade fighting scattered bands of Native Americans. General Philip Sheridan designed a three-pronged movement to converge on the Lakota gathering. General George Crook would move north from Fort Fetterman. Colonel John Gibbon would move east from Fort Ellis in Montana. And General Alfred Terry, with Custer's 7th Cavalry as his strike force, would move west from Fort Abraham Lincoln. They would trap the Lakota between them and force a decisive battle. There were just a few problems with this plan. First, they had no idea how many warriors they were actually facing. Intelligence estimates ranged from 800 to maybe 1,500 warriors. They were off by a factor of 2 or possibly more. Second, they were planning to use tactics developed in the Civil War and in campaigns against other tribes, tactics that assumed cavalry charges and massed firepower would overwhelm any Native American force. They were about to face warriors who had been perfecting mounted warfare for 150 years. And third, they severely underestimated the terrain, the distances, and the difficulty of coordinating 3 separate columns across hundreds of miles of wilderness with no telegraph, no radio, just dispatch riders on horses. On June 17th, Crook's column ran into Crazy Horse and about 1,000 warriors at the Rosebud River. The Lakota and Cheyenne attacked with such ferocity that Crook was forced to retreat after 6 hours of fighting. He pulled back to his base camp and sent no word to Terry or Gibbon that he was out of the campaign. One prong of the 3-pronged attack had already been broken, and nobody else knew it. 8 days later, on June 25, 1876, Custer's 7th Cavalry found the Lakota and Cheyenne village on the Little Bighorn River. They'd been searching for days. pushing their horses hard, desperate to strike before the Indians could scatter. What they found was the largest Native American village most of them had ever seen, stretching for almost 3 miles along the river. And Custer, looking at this vast encampment in the valley below, made a decision that would become one of the most debated moments in American military history. He decided to attack immediately, without waiting for reinforcements, without even knowing exactly how many warriors were down there. The stage was set for annihilation. June 25th, 1876, early afternoon. Major Marcus Reno led 3 companies of the 7th Cavalry, about 140 men, down into the valley of the Little Bighorn River. Custer had split his command into 3 battalions, a decision that still makes military historians wince. Reno would attack the southern end of the village. Captain Frederick Benteen would scout to the left and serve as reserve. Custer himself would take 5 companies, about 210 men, north along the ridgeline, looking for a place to strike the village from another angle. They expected to catch the Indians by surprise, to stampede them into retreat like had happened in so many other army attacks on Native American villages. What happened instead was tactical annihilation so complete, so swift, that soldiers who survived could barely process what they'd experienced. Reno's battalion splashed across the Little Bighorn River and formed a skirmish line in the timber at the southern edge of the village. For about 5 minutes, it must have seemed like a standard operation. Soldiers dismounted, every 4th man holding horses, the rest spreading out in a line firing into the village. And then the village responded. Warriors poured out of the lodges, hundreds of them, then more hundreds, grabbing weapons, leaping onto horses without saddles, coming fast. Sitting Bull was there, not fighting because of his recent Sundance ordeal, but shouting encouragement, rallying warriors. Gall, the Hunkpapa war leader whose family had been killed in the initial attack, came with rage that made him nearly unstoppable. Crazy Horse was racing from the north end of camp with hundreds more warriors. The Lakota and Cheyenne weren't running. They were counterattacking with overwhelming force. This is where all that mounted warfare expertise came into play with devastating effect. Warriors didn't charge in straight lines like cavalry. They rode in swirling circles, appearing and disappearing in clouds of dust they deliberately kicked up. Soldiers firing at what they thought was a target would find nothing but dust and air. The warriors used the terrain, every gully, every rise, every bit of cover. They'd appear, fire arrows or guns, drop back, appear somewhere else. It was psychological warfare as much as physical combat, designed to create panic and confusion. And it worked. Within 20 minutes, Reno's skirmish line was collapsing. Soldiers were running low on ammunition, watching comrades go down, seeing more and more warriors appearing from every direction. The Arikara scouts who'd been with the battalion took one look at the thousands of warriors and decided they'd done their job. They left. Reno, realizing his position was untenable, ordered a retreat back across the river. What should have been an orderly withdrawal became a bloody rout. Soldiers ran for their horses in chaos. Some men didn't make it, cut down in the timber by warriors who rode right through the position. The retreat to the river turned into a nightmare that survivors would remember for the rest of their lives. Horses plunging down steep banks into the water, soldiers swept away by the current, their heavy wool uniforms soaking up water and pulling them under. Warriors riding along the banks, shooting down into the mass of men and animals, thrashing in the river. It was slaughter. Lieutenant Benjamin Hodgson was shot in the leg while crossing the river, then shot again and killed in the water. Bloody Knife, Custer's favorite Arikara scout, had his head blown apart by a bullet that splattered blood and brains across Reno's face. The civilian interpreter Isaiah Dorman, an African-American man who'd lived with the Lakota and married a Lakota woman, was cut off and killed. Some warriors, recognizing him, gave him water before he died. But they couldn't save him from others seeking revenge. The survivors scrambled up the bluffs on the east side of the river and dug in on what would become known as Reno Hill. They'd lost maybe 40 men in less than an hour. and they were barely holding together as a fighting force. Benteen's battalion arrived to reinforce them, and they set up a defensive perimeter, knowing they were in serious trouble. But at least they were still alive and still fighting. 5 miles north, Custer's battalion was dying. We'll never know exactly what Custer was thinking or planning, because not one man in his command survived to tell the story. But archaeology, Lakota and Cheyenne accounts, and the physical evidence paint a picture of tactical disaster meeting perfect execution. Custer apparently tried to ford the river at what's now called Medicine Tail Coulee, but warriors in the village had been alerted by the sounds of fighting at Reno's position. They met Custer with enough firepower to turn him back, so Custer pulled up onto the ridges, probably hoping to find another crossing point or to take a defensive position until Reno and Benteen could support him. He never got the chance. Crazy Horse, after helping drive Reno across the river, led a massive force of warriors north to engage Custer. At the same time, Gall brought hundreds more warriors from the village, hitting Custer from another direction. It was a double envelopment, a pincer movement that cut Custer's battalion into pieces. The thing about fighting mounted warriors on broken terrain, you can't form an effective defensive square like you could against European cavalry on a flat battlefield. The gullies and ravines gave the Lakota and Cheyenne covered approaches from multiple directions. Custer's men couldn't see threats until warriors were already on top of them, and those warriors were using every technique they'd perfected over generations. High arc arrow fire meant arrows coming down from above like mortar rounds, hitting men who thought they were in cover. Warriors could put an arrow high enough in the sky that it fell almost vertically, and they did this while riding at full gallop. Soldiers hiding behind dead horses suddenly had arrows dropping on them from overhead. The psychological impact was devastating. Counting coup, the practice of touching an enemy in combat to prove bravery, meant warriors rode right into the defensive positions, striking soldiers with coup sticks before killing them. Imagine being a soldier, already terrified, low on ammunition, watching your comrades die, and then a warrior rides straight at you, close enough to touch you with a stick. And you realize he's treating you like prey, like something beneath respect. Before he kills you, companies were isolated from each other, cut off and destroyed one by one. Lieutenant James Calhoun's company died on what's now called Calhoun Hill. Captain Miles Keogh's company made it a bit farther north before being wiped out. The last stand on what's now called Last Stand Hill probably lasted just minutes. Not the hours of heroic defense that later artists would imagine. Archaeological work at the battlefield in the 1980s, using metal detectors to find cartridge cases and bullets, revealed the movement patterns of both soldiers and warriors. It showed soldiers falling back, trying to maintain positions, but steadily being overwhelmed. It showed warriors with repeating rifles firing from multiple directions. It showed absolute chaos in the final moments. Soldiers shot their horses to use as barricades, but cavalry horses aren't trained for that kind of noise and violence. The animals panicked, broke away, left men exposed. Some soldiers tried to run, making it maybe 50 or 100 yards before being ridden down. The physical evidence shows execution-style shots at close range, as wounded soldiers were finished off. It shows mutilation of bodies afterwards, traditional practice meant to prevent the dead from being whole in the afterlife and to send a message to other enemies. 210 men died on those ridges above the Little Bighorn River. The entire fight, from first contact to last shot, probably took less than an hour, maybe 45 minutes. About the same amount of time as a typical television drama. The Lakota and Cheyenne warriors stripped the bodies of weapons, ammunition, and anything else useful. Some took uniforms, some took scalps. They left the bodies where they fell in the June heat. It would be 2 days before General Terry's column found them, and the scene that greeted them was so horrific that soldiers refused to describe it in letters home. Custer's body, stripped but not mutilated, his golden hair still identifying him, lay among his men on that hill. The Battle of the Little Bighorn was over. The Lakota and Cheyenne had won the most complete tactical victory any Native American force would ever achieve against the United States Army. They'd destroyed an entire battalion, humiliated the military, proven their superiority in mobile warfare. It was their greatest triumph, and it would be their death sentence. The news reached the eastern United States on July 4th, 1876, during the centennial celebrations of American independence. The timing couldn't have been worse or more perfect, depending on your perspective. As Americans were celebrating 100 years of nationhood, congratulating themselves on their progress and power, word arrived that a decorated Civil War hero and his entire command had been wiped out by Indians on the frontier. The shock was immediate and immense. George Armstrong Custer, who'd been a controversial and often criticized figure in life, became a martyred hero in death. Newspaper illustrations showed him making a gallant last stand, saber in hand, surrounded by his brave men, fighting to the end against overwhelming savage hordes. Never mind that Custer's men had left their sabers behind because they were useless in plains warfare. Never mind that the battle was a tactical disaster born of poor intelligence and worse judgment. Never mind that the Lakota and Cheyenne were defending their homes and families. The narrative that took hold was one of civilization versus savagery, of innocent soldiers murdered by treacherous Indians, and that narrative demanded vengeance. The United States Army responded with overwhelming force. Congress, which had been reluctant to fund large military operations against Native Americans, suddenly opened the Treasury. General Sherman and General Sheridan, who'd commanded armies of hundreds of thousands during the Civil War, brought that same total war mentality to the plains. They didn't just want to defeat the Lakota and Cheyenne militarily. They wanted to destroy their ability to resist forever. The great village that had won at Little Bighorn broke apart shortly after the battle, bands scattering in different directions as they always did after large gatherings. That mobility that had been such a strength now became a weakness. The army hunted them relentlessly, using winter campaigns that targeted villages when they were most vulnerable. In winter, horses were weak from lack of good grazing. People couldn't move their lodges quickly, and food was scarce. The army struck again and again, burning villages, destroying food supplies, capturing horse herds. Colonel Nelson Miles caught Sitting Bull's band in October at Cedar Creek. 5 months later, Sitting Bull led his people across the border into Canada, into the land the Lakota called Grandmother's Country, because they recognized Queen Victoria's sovereignty there. He'd stay for 4 years, but without the buffalo herds and with Canadian authorities pressuring him to return to the United States, he eventually had no choice. In 1881, Sitting Bull surrendered at Fort Buford. The great holy man who'd united the tribes, who'd had the vision of soldiers falling, spent the rest of his life on a reservation until he was killed by Indian police during an arrest attempt in 1890. Crazy Horse fought on through the winter of 1876 and into the spring of 1877, but his people were starving, freezing, exhausted. In May 1877, he led his band into Fort Robinson to surrender. 4 months later, soldiers killed him while allegedly trying to escape. He was somewhere between 33 and 35 years old, the greatest tactical warrior the Lakota had ever produced, stabbed by a soldier's bayonet while Indian police held his arms. But the army's most effective weapon wasn't bullets or cavalry charges. It was the systematic destruction of the buffalo herds. By the early 1870s, commercial hunters with long-range rifles were killing buffalo by the millions for their hides. The army actively encouraged this, understanding perfectly that without the buffalo, the plains tribes couldn't maintain their nomadic way of life. General Sheridan supposedly said that buffalo hunters had done more to settle the Indian problem in 2 years than the army had done in 30. By 1883, there were perhaps only a few hundred buffalo left from herds that had numbered in the millions. The entire plains economy, the foundation of Lakota power, was gone. Without the buffalo, without their horse herds, scattered and defeated, the Lakota had no choice but to accept reservation life. The warrior societies were prohibited from practicing their traditions. The sun dance was banned. Children were taken from their families and sent to boarding schools designed to erase their culture and language. The people who had controlled a territory the size of France, who had defeated the United States Army in open battle, were confined to reservations and dependent on government rations for survival. The Battle of the Little Bighorn became a permanent part of American mythology. But the version that entered popular culture bore little resemblance to what actually happened. It became a story about American heroism in the face of savagery, about manifest destiny temporarily checked but ultimately triumphant. Custer became an icon, his face on everything from advertisements to Wild West shows. The tactical brilliance of the Lakota and Cheyenne warriors, the military genius of leaders like Crazy Horse and Gall, the justice of their cause in defending their land, all of that was buried under layers of myth and propaganda. But here's what's remarkable. The actual history, once you dig into it, is far more compelling than the myth. Modern military analysts study Little Bighorn as a case study in what happens when you underestimate your enemy, when you ignore intelligence, when you divide your forces in the face of superior numbers and mobility. The battle demonstrates principles of asymmetric warfare that remain relevant today. A technologically advanced conventional force, confident in its superiority, destroyed by a lighter, more mobile enemy that understood the terrain and controlled the tempo of engagement. The Lakota victory at Little Bighorn was total and complete. They achieved everything that military success can achieve on a battlefield. And yet, within 5 years, their entire way of life was destroyed. Because military victory, however brilliant, can't overcome the long-term realities of demographics, economics, and political will. The United States could lose a battalion, mourn its dead, and then return with overwhelming force and unlimited resources. The Lakota and Cheyenne couldn't afford even their victory. The bullets they used, the weapons they captured, they couldn't replace them. The army could. Today, the Little Bighorn battlefield is a place of strange contradictions. There's a monument to the 7th Cavalry, listing every soldier who died. In 1991, they added a memorial to the Lakota and Cheyenne warriors, acknowledging finally that two sides fought there and both showed courage. Tourists walk the ridges where Custer's men made their last stand, where white marble markers show where bodies were found. It's peaceful now, quiet except for the wind that blows constantly across those hills. The battle remains simultaneously the Lakota's greatest military achievement and the event that triggered their final defeat. It's a reminder that winning the battle and winning the war are not the same thing. And it's a testament to a people who fought with extraordinary skill and courage for their land, their freedom, and their way of life, even as history's tide was turning against them. The warriors who rode down those ridges on June 25, 1876, achieved something that day that no other Native American force ever would. They destroyed an entire United States Army battalion in open combat. They proved their tactical superiority beyond any doubt. They showed the world what mounted warriors at the absolute peak of their art could accomplish. It just wasn't enough to change the ending that was already written.